got rid of that. So great to see you guys. Hope you had a nice holiday season and are back and refreshed and ready to go. It seems like a while ago that we met, so let's recap just a little bit. Number one, the thing that we talked about with this group is trying to maintain a level of transparency, make sure that this is an open process, both within this group, but more importantly, or just as importantly, within your community. And so anything that we're doing that at some point you go, wait a minute, we need to make sure we're transparent here. Make sure you remind us, help us so that in the end, even if people didn't like what the decision was, they couldn't argue about what the process was and who was able to be involved in it. So transparency is key. I also want to remind you about the decision-making process that we talked about in the first meeting and actually voted on, agreed on, is that if we come to a place to where we have to vote on something, normally it's just a thumbs up, thumb sideways, thumbs down. But if we had to vote on something and 75% of the work group agreed on whatever it was we were voting on, then everybody agreed that they'd go along and that would be a decision. And so that was a threshold that we set with 75%, so 3/4 of the people here. Couple meetings ago, we put together and then issued a community survey, got over 400 responses. The last meeting, we went over that. We'll talk more about that today as we get to our trying to decide criteria and what we're going to place most important in our decision-making process. And you know, that'll be something we have to keep looking back on. We got some really interesting stuff coming your way in this meeting. Rob's going to go over the PSU demographic study that was done a couple of years ago. Then we're going to have Jason talk to us about kind of the city growth expectations and so forth. Those two discussions kind of go together. And then we've had questions about building capacities and how many students can fit in each building and what our plans are there. So there's going to be a presentation, short presentation about how many students each building can hold and what our plan should be around that. We'll have an opportunity for public comment, which I'll let Rob talk about here shortly. And then we'll go through our criteria prioritization, look at what feedback we got from you and kind of come up with what that plan is. And then Steve's put together with some help from 5 Maps, some scenarios, which we talked about how, you know, some ideas last time. They've kind of put that on paper now, some that may work and some that obviously didn't work, and we'll share those with you as well. And so that's kind of what's in store tonight. Rob, you want to talk a little bit about the public comment, make sure we get that out on the table right now?
Sure, yeah, I'm the public comment guy. Hey, everybody.
Yes, you are.
Good to see everybody back again. Hey, on the public comment, on the agenda tonight, we have it scheduled for 7 o'clock. It could happen a little bit earlier than that if we, you know, kind of move along. Could be as early as 6:50. So, just want to give people a heads up as we're going here. It's about 6:10 right now. If you want to give public comment and you're listening now, and we'll talk about this again in a second. Just use the chat feature on the Zoom call here to request to speak on Zoom, or you can email a request to feedback@silverfalls.k12.or.us. And like the commercials, I'll say it again. That is feedback@silverfalls.k12.or.us. And we've made a commitment to use the same public comment rules and that kind of thing that the Silver Falls School District uses in their board meetings. And so even though, yes, so I'll just leave it at that. Randy.
Thanks for the infomercial. Appreciate that. So let's go ahead. Does anybody have a question? I see a hand. Any questions there? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the PSU demographic study. One of the things we talked about in the first couple meetings is trying to collect all the information we can. And one of the questions we've had all along is what kind of growth do we expect in Silverton and what are the projections there? How do we take that into play as we start having these discussions about boundaries and how many kids could put in each school and so forth? And so Rob's put together some information on that and he'll go ahead and cover the Portland State study.
So hopefully I'll see that PowerPoint kick up someplace. looking.
Sorry here, Rob. It's coming here.
Okay, no worries. I can I can start a little bit. So school districts statewide actually have made a pretty good habit of doing demographic studies to understand what growth looks like, and it's really important for them to do that because there are two big components that come with that. One is, just thinking about future buildings and that kind of thing, and if they would ever need to go out for a bond to increase capacity. And the other is that school districts receive funding based on how many students attend every year. And so this becomes a really important concept when you start to think about your budget and your buildings long-term, to have a pretty good and accurate projection of what your growth looks like long-term downstream. So Silver Falls had a demographic study done by the PSU Population Research Center. It was a study that was done in 2017 and covers out to 2027 in some parts of it and 2030 in some other parts of it. Charles Reinerson is the lead at the PSU Population Research Center. I worked with Charles when I was in Sherwood in the Tigard-Tualatin School District, and have found that the results and the work that they do is always really good. We go next.
Are you seeing it on the screen?
I see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are other people seeing it okay? All right, great. So let's go to the second slide. There's just 5 here, so I'm not going to kill you with this stuff. What I wanted to do is try to get cut to the chase on this. There's a ton of data in this report, and it takes quite a while to read, and it's kind of dense, some parts of it, and other parts of it are really easy. But I wanted to try to cut to the chase on how they go about their methodology and what it happened to say about elementary school growth, particularly in Silver Falls, over the next 5 to 7 years. So they use a methodology that I think is really interesting, and when you dig into it and understand it, it becomes very common sense as to how they arrive at their numbers, and actually then gives you a lot of confidence in what those numbers are. So I thought it would be important for you all to understand the methodology. The first thing they do is look at historic growth. So they look at growth over the previous 10 years in the district boundary, which includes both the city and the surrounding area. So it isn't just the city of Silverton, but it's the entirety of the district, the Silver Falls School District. And then they also look at economic trends over time, the previous 10 years and the future 10 years, because sometimes when economics change, the number of people who live someplace can change if there's a new business that comes into town or leaves and what have you. And so knowing if there's an important economic trend is one that they need to consider strongly. And then secondly, housing trends over time. It's really interesting to look at the report and see what has happened with housing in your community over time, to a pretty good blip early, and then of course the downturn where it shut off quite a bit, and then a couple big years. But more or less what you'll see is that there has been over time about 50 new housing starts in your community over the previous 10 years, and likely over some years in the future, and you'll hear more from the city about that today. Slide 3. So they also take a look at enrollment trends, again, the historic enrollment trends, and then they look at public and private capture rates. So they want to know, do these kids, the kids who live in your community, where do they attend school? Do they attend in the public schools, or do they go to private schools? And what's the capture rate look like over time? And what's it likely to look like in the future? One of the most interesting ones that makes a ton of sense to me is live birth rates. And so they use zip codes to figure out live birth rates, and then can pretty accurately predict the number of kindergartners that are going to show up in your schools 5 or 6 years later. And if you read the report, you can see that there have been some blips in birth rate over time in the Silver Falls School District, and then yet a fair amount of consistency over the last 3 or 4 years. They also take a hard look at in-migration, how many people are moving into the community, and how many students do you have who are transferring in or out. So I suppose there's some out migration in and out of your school district, so that they can understand that. And again, it's previous 10 years and likely future 10. And then more specifically, some individual school trends, because some schools are within the school district boundaries and some are outside, and that impacts all of these things to a certain degree. And so individual school trends are important to look at too, again, previous 10 and future 10 and current. And then enrollment projections by district and by school. So they actually make projections 10 years out as to what their expectations are for both the district and each individual school. Slide 4. So the prediction that they come up with for your school district is that there'll be a 2% growth rate through 26-27 school year. And that means that from today, or actually it was 2017-18 to 26-27 school year, that there would be a 2% growth rate in toto. So that the total population of your school district would grow by 2% over that 10-year period, which would be a net increase of 71 students over that same time period. And they do a high rate, a low rate, and then a highly likely rate. And I use the highly likely because it is. And it always seems to be the one that is most accurate. And then finally, individual schools, and this is kind of cutting to the chase on this. They would say that when they look at individual school enrollment and predict ahead to 26-27 for Mark Twain and Robert Frost, specifically the schools that we're working on, that there would be an increase of 64 students combined. The other really interesting thing that they say is that all elementary schools combined in the district, they think are likely to increase by 43 students total, which means that all the other elementary schools in your district would actually shrink by a total of 21 students. So you'd have minus 21 in all the other schools, plus 64 in Twain and Frost, which means that you'd have a net total of 43 district-wide. So that is kind of the report in a nutshell. The really important concept here for me as I read this, and the thing I kept looking for as I looked through it and prepared this, hopefully, explanation of the report, was trying to understand whether or not there would be enough capacity in Mark Twain and Robert Frost immediately and 5 years out and 7 years out. And based on the data that I see, and after we talk about capacity a little bit later today, I think that the answer is definitely yes. So that is my report and PowerPoint. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have some.
So Steve, if you could take the PowerPoint down so we can see faces, and then raised hands of anybody who'd like to ask questions, comments, thoughts about what that was, again, PSU study.
Did it all make sense, or did I go too fast?
Okay, I'll tell you, we had a PSU study like that in Tillamook, and all of a sudden we had a kindergarten class that was about 25% larger than we'd ever seen before. And we went back to live birth rates, we went back to all kinds of things, could not figure it out. And all of a sudden one person said, wait a minute, wasn't 5 years ago when we had our bad storm and we were out of power for 5 days? And everybody went, oh, and you can't study that at Portland State. So anyway, we've got this information. What we gained from it the most was the fact that we have pretty good confidence based on that study that we'll have room, but because sometimes studies are different than what's actually happening on the ground, we asked the city, and in this case Jason, to come and talk to us about what he sees, what you all see out in Silverton, and what's projected over the course of the next, I don't know how far you can go out, Jason, but I'll turn it over to you and let you talk to us about potential growth opportunities there.
Sure, thank you. My name is Jason Gottgetrew. I'm the Community Development Director with the City of Silverton. I can share my screen. So kind of in looking at that past history that was referenced in the PSU study, kind of going back over the last 15 years, the city coming kind of leading up to the recession did have some pretty big years of 100 homes in 2006 and 2007. And when the recession hit, dropped down into the kind of low teens. And then the kind of years after that got back up to that 40 to 60 range. So the average of 50 new single family dwelling homes has kind of been the historical average and the expected average moving forward. Now in looking at and then kind of the running total, just kind of continuing. So in that 15-year period, we did about 600 new homes. And looking at the city's housing needs analysis, which was adopted just recently, that's a 20-year document. So that kind of looks out of what's to be expected over the next 20 years. And that was anticipating an additional 1,100 homes over that 20-year planning horizon. Kind of a little bit about the development process. The city doesn't build subdivisions. We don't build streets. We review development applications from people that own property or are buying large lots and dividing them into lots of smaller lots, with building the roads and the sewer pipes and the water pipes to serve them. So a lot of it's based on those market conditions, if there's interest in developers to build those roads. The development process itself, kind of from start to finish, can take a number of years. When you're going through the subdivision process, it's reviewed by the Planning Commission, and that's a couple of months, and then you have to design the roads and all the sewer pipes and all the water pipes. So that's a couple of months, and they actually have to build all of that, which can be years sometimes. So the kind of start to finish, from original project application to actually building houses, can be in the 2 to 3 year range, sometimes more. Kind of in looking at where the growth is going to occur in Silverton, there are 2 lines that circle Silverton. One's the Silverton city limits, and the other is the urban growth boundary. So lands that are within the city limits are under the jurisdiction of the city of Silverton and can develop to the urban densities per the Silverton Development Code. This is well, there's 3 colors on this map, but of the 2 colors, there's a blue and a sandy color. The blue color is the existing Silverton city limits, with the sandy color being the urban growth boundary. And then the green color are the properties that are within the city limits that are of developable size. A lot of the land within the city has already developed with housing. So in looking at the kind of most likely next development potential lots, kind of the existing lots within the city limits are the ones where developers could apply for subdivisions to build more roads and water and sewer pipes to create more buildable lots. So that's kind of that 2 to 3 year process from application to actual ability to submit building permits. So in looking at kind of Silverton as a whole, the areas that, and this is incorrect, the areas that are underlined in the kind of the darker green are the properties that already have a planning commission subdivision approval. So they're in process to actually start preparing those construction drawings to actually start building those projects. Some are kind of further along than others, but there's kind of 5 of the kind of larger properties that are within that approval process of having planning commission approval, but just need to kind of follow through the construction of those projects. One of those is down in the Pioneer Village area. There's going to be 36 additional lots within that area. On Oak Street, kind of across the street from the senior care home in the what's known as the Olson property, that was 59 dwellings that was approved. On the corner of James and Jefferson, there are 47 dwellings going to be there that are already approved for that location. And then off of Railway Avenue, there's a planned unit development that's approved for 134 units. This one's a little different than those previously mentioned ones, as this one is a mixture of single-family homes, single-family attached homes, which are essentially a duplex with a lot line between them, and apartments. So there'll be 64 apartments located on that site, 1 or 2 bedroom units. And then the single-family homes, I believe, are in the 50 range, or probably 60 range, and then the remaining probably 30 units or so are going to be the single-family attached home. So that's going to be kind of a mixture of different housing types. So then when we're looking at the kind of other potential developable lots within city limits, those are kind of the green areas, and the kind of number that's on there is the potential lot that could be developed on the site. Again, the city doesn't dictate how many lots are developed on the site. We just create the the minimums in terms of lot size and street width and other development standards that developers have to design their development to. So there's kind of the other potential development areas within town. So kind of when all these numbers are added up, I probably should have done that earlier. It's about in the 400 to 500 range of potential lots kind of within the existing city limits. And then in terms of kind of future development and the rate of that, we do just anticipate the typical 50 single family homes per year. One of the items that came out of that housing needs analysis looked at the zoning designation of the potential development lots in the city of Silverton and the urban growth boundary. And that shows that essentially of those lots that are developable, essentially they're all zoned for or designated for a single family. So that's our 7,000 square foot minimum lot size standard. But with the housing needs analysis indicated is that there is additional need kind of based on the demographics of the existing population, that there is more of a need for alternative or for more middle housing types, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, apartments than what is currently designated on the zoning map. So one of the things that the Planning Commission and City Council is currently undertaking is finding ways and policies to kind of change that mixture of housing that we have typically seen over the past 15 or 20 years. We've had the two apartments within recent memory, the Silver Place apartments out on Boschholm Street, and then the Garden City apartments down on South Water Street. So those are kind of the two recent multifamily developments where the mixture kind of outside of that has all been single family homes on single family lots. So part of the kind of development pattern moving forward is to try to find ways to kind of not necessarily develop more housing, but develop more of a range of housing within the existing kind of growth projections of the kind of the PSU study. And they do our population projections as well. And then when you're looking kind of outside the city limits, in order to develop that property to urban densities, that requires an annexation, which is a review by the Planning Commission and City Council based on kind of 14 different review criteria. And then kind of in looking at where the potential growth outside the city limits are, kind of the area up at the edge of Crestview is kind of an area that there's large parcels, relatively flat. So those are kind of expected to develop at that 4 units per acre range, which is your kind of typical single family development. So kind of there's 90 acres out there. But again, this is not something that the city does. This would require a property owner or developer that acquired this land to make an application, have that application approved, and then go through that subdivision process. So that's kind of a lengthy process within itself. The northerly part of town has some land that's within the urban growth boundary. This is kind of less conducive to development from that easterly section because the existing lots are smaller, so there's more property owners, so less of a chance to just buy one large piece of property to develop that. So there's a lot of kind of more infill style development that would have to occur north of the Hobart Road area. Kind of similar on the western end of Silverton out by Pine Street, kind of past the high school. There's land within the urban growth boundary, but these are kind of the historical long skinny lots where people still farmed back then. So they wanted to have land, but also access to the road. So you get kind of those long skinny lots, which was functional back then, but kind of makes the development of those kind of more challenging in terms of kind of the units per acre. So there's kind of less capacity than those larger, flatter lots on the eastern portion of the city. And then there's just a bit more outside of the city limits across the street from the Oregon Garden by Westfield and Cascade Highway. And then kind of the area between Pioneer Village and Abaquah Heights, this area is impacted by hillside. So the city does have hillside overlay standards that kind of have different standards for lot size and street grade and street width for development within those hillsides. So kind of the development potential of that area is not as great as the kind of larger, flatter parts of town. And then there's some additional kind of development potential properties adjacent to the Pioneer Village area, kind of below Quall Road in that area. So kind of in looking at the kind of potential capacity, there is land within the urban growth boundary, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to develop within the next 20 years. We do expect kind of that historical 50 units per year to be constructed, and are trying to find policies to kind of intersperse kind of all other housing types than just single family detached dwellings as part of that. But that's something that's going to be ongoing as we kind of develop and try to find what policies would work best for Silverton through that process. So that's kind of the kind of overview. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
First question is how long it took you to run that program. Nicely done. Those programs are not easy to manage, and so well done. Jason, I had a question as to your confidence in the PSU study. You said about 50 looks like the right thing to plan on, and as Rob said, then it extrapolates out to that 60, 70 students growth over time, and so you feel comfortable with that as well?
I've kind of just briefly looked at that PSU study, and certainly projecting students is not something I've done. I thought about it a little earlier today, and kids grow, so it's a moving number. But the 50 homes or 50 dwellings per year, kind of on an increasing 2%, is kind of what we've anticipate.
So Jason, I have a question, if that's okay. Do you know, are you all thinking, I know I also took a look at the Echo Northwest study that you all have. And I think that's the other study that you referenced about housing density and so forth and different kinds of homes. Are you all leaning towards taking some of those recommendations and using them? I know that there was a call for a lot more apartment types of buildings and that kind of thing. I'm just curious because typically apartments will have fewer kids than single family home.
Yeah, we are trying to develop policies that would allow for more of a range of housing within Silverton. Kind of as I mentioned earlier, pretty much all the vacant developable land currently within the city limits and all of it within the urban growth boundary is designated for single family detached. So to the extent that we can develop policies that allow for more ranges of housing type, not necessarily additional units that would, the 50 single family homes plus more apartments, but rather just trying to have more of a mixture of different housing units within that existing growth kind of projection.
Okay, thanks. I saw a couple other things that I thought were interesting. It looked like average age is going up in the community, so that there must be an older population that has more recently over the last 10 years moved to the community. And I saw that the average household size is 2.76 people, which I think is interesting. And for our purposes, 16.2% of the population in the district is from age 5 to 14. Just a couple little weird data points out there. I start to geek out about this stuff, so I'll stop.
Any questions from anybody else? If Jason, you want to drop that, we'll go back there, your screen. We'll actually see it is Mr. Adams.
Jason, thanks for the presentation. I just want to try to recap so I understand correctly. The green area, and we don't need the map, but the green areas were representing properties that are some form or fashion in current development. And so we can kind of project kind of how the numbers that you shared as far as approximate houses. I think I know the answer, but from your perspective, in the yellow category or the beige category, do you have any ideas or projections on which of those properties may be developed next, or areas you think will be developed?
So for the first point, there was kind of the properties in green, but then there were properties in green that had a dark green underline. It was only those ones that had that dark green underline that had their planning commission approval. So most of those properties are still just vacant with potential, not vacant with planning approvals. So there was, yeah, the kind of 5 projects that have their planning commission approval. With regard to the urban growth boundary and kind of what properties would be next, that's kind of a harder question to answer, since that is up to the individual property owners to submit the annexation request, and then up to the planning commission and city council to determine if they meet the review criteria and if the annexation is timely.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Jason? Kyle.
Yeah, not so much a question. I just wanted to thank Jason for bringing his expertise to this process. It's wonderful to hear a Jason Gakatru report in a meeting that I don't have to run. That's a rarity for me. But also with regards to your question to his mastery of that program, I could find out where he lives, wake him up at 3 a.m. and he could deliver that report before his eyes were open. He really is an encyclopedia of this kind of information for the city. So I'm glad you guys had him come in and do this.
Well, I really appreciate your time. When we asked who, everybody pointed at Jason and said, he's the guy that can do this and tell us if we're on the right track or not. And what I heard from him in this report is that, first of all, I think we're okay. We're not seeing mass growth in numbers that we're not going to be able to handle as we look forward. And so that's good. I also saw, as I looked at the areas in green that have the dark green underline, that they were spread out in ways to where they're not all going to be in one, no matter how you divide it. They're not going to all be in one school. And that's also a good thing. And so that report combined with the PSU study gives me great confidence that your in-town schools are going to be able to handle the population that you have as we move forward. There'll be other things we talk about in the flexibility that Silverton has around student population in their schools, more so than most districts have, that'll also help you as you move forward in this process. So Jason, thank you so much for your knowledge, for your presentation, for your willingness to help this group out.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was fun.
All right, we're going to move on to answering one of the questions that has come up, at least Rob and I have raised several times to each other, is, okay, how many students do each of these buildings actually have a capacity for when we go to the structure that we're going to go to in a K-5 setting? And so we've asked the district, and I believe Leslie was the winner or the loser. I don't know which, but I think Leslie is going to give us kind of an overview of what each of those buildings make up, student population and capacity will be.
Yes, I am. And Steve's going to share a slide so you all have a visual. So capacity at Mark Twain and Robert Frost are about 100 student difference. Mark Twain's at 350 and Robert Frost is at 450. Current enrollment and last year's enrollment. So we just want to be really transparent that COVID has impacted our enrollment. And so what the numbers that we're seeing right now were not our numbers last year. So Mark Twain right now is at 288 and Robert Frost is at 346. And last year, Mark Twain was at 349. So they were at capacity. And Robert Frost was at 406. So just general classroom instructional spaces, Mark Twain has 18 classroom instructional spaces. And right now they're being used for a variety of things, not just classrooms. There's an ELD room, an LRC room, which is a special education room, title services, counseling services, a sensory space. So all sorts of those things are fitting inside those spaces as well. And then they have 2 small group instructional spaces. And at Robert Frost, there are 21 classroom instructional spaces. And within those 21 classroom spaces, there are 3 district-wide special education self-contained classrooms, as well as ELD, LRC, title, counseling, sensory. So all of those same things are at both buildings. And then there are also 7 small group instructional spaces. So a little bit of difference just in spaces that you can see, which is why capacity is different. Are there any questions that I could answer for anyone about capacity size? Kyle Henderson.
Leslie, do you remember what our capacity was your first year when we had 4 grade levels?
Yeah, when we had 4 grade levels, we were, I think, just over 500.
Okay. And that was jamming.
It was very, very full.
Yeah.
And we
We
used
also,
the church across the
We
parking
also
lot.
used a couple rooms from the church there that year.
Yeah.
One of the questions that come up all the way through this process is, okay, what numbers do we look at? As you saw in that chart, the numbers that we've had historically and the numbers that we have right now are very different. Silverton's no different than every other district in the state right now. There's a lot less kids actually attending school because most of them aren't attending school. And so what we have looked at is the percentage of the overall population that we can handle in each school. And we ended up breaking that down, Steve actually did. And we know that we can handle at Robert Frost about 55% of the students, and at Mark Twain about 45%. Is that correct, Steve?
Yes.
Okay. And so historically, although, we've had the 750 kids or whatever you might have, we believe that if we take the students that we have now, which I think we'll see later is in the 500s somewhere, if we take those students and we figure out where they're living and we divide them in a 55-45 split, then it's got the sample size we need in order to extrapolate that out when all kids come back. And we do believe that all kids are going to come back once we're back into school in a regular setting, whenever that happens. And so as you look at that and as we move forward, as we look at scenarios, then our goal in these scenarios would take the students that we currently have, divide them or draw lines to where we could have 55% in the Robert Frost area and 45% of whatever that number is in the Mark Twain area. And that should work as we move forward. So that's an assumption that we're making because those are the students that we have to work with now. Discussion, thoughts, questions about that? Does it make sense? Okay, I'm going to wake you up. Mr. Adams.
Yeah, so I'll be the one to say, I don't know if it makes sense to me. Conceptually, yes, but in my head, if you were, I have not done this before, so I'm interested to get educated. But if you were to just ask me simply, how would I do it? It would seem more that we would look at geographic boundaries or roadways as the first filter, and then see where the students that we currently have enrolled fit into that system. Because to me, just thinking through geographic boundaries, snow zones, roadways seem to be more of a long-term boundary line that would be something to look at as a first filter.
No, and I think that's 100% true. And so what I was trying to say was that you will use your geographic boundaries, but to know whether those are going to work, it's really going to, if you have 80% of the students you have right now, even though that may put 450 into Robert Frost, you know that number is going to grow when all kids come back. And so you draw the geographic boundaries so that the percent of students are in the right place. And then when all students come back, you're assuming that all the students that aren't coming right now are not in one school zone, whatever that school zone is drawn as. And so that's a good point. Any other?
That's exactly right, Dave, is that so if we use 214 as a geographic boundary, for example, if we did that and 80% of those kids were on one side and only 20 on the other side, we'd have a problem down the road. But if we did that and the current attendees were 45, 55, then I would assume that it's probably going to work down the road when all the kids come back next year.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's sort of both of those at the same time. So perfect.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Kyle. On mute.
Does the program only work for current enrollment then?
So that would be a Steve question, actually a 5 maps question. Steve, do you know, or Leslie?
Well, the data that we loaded in was based on our October 1st enrollment of this year. So that was just what we did. I suppose we could do another data load from October 1st of last year, but we did want to capture this year's students. This would be kind of at the beginning of my presentation, but just since we're talking about these numbers, we've said obviously the capacity of both schools is about 800 students at about a 55-45% split. Give or take a few percentage points either way for either school there. But Robert Frost actually obviously has the higher capacity. So in a normal year, we would be looking at anywhere from 740 to 780 enrollment at those schools. But those schools always do have a relatively high number of students attending from outside the boundary area, either in other areas of Silver Falls School District or outside the district, intra or inter-district transfers. So for this year, for example, we have 647 students. So we're down 108 students from last year, 755 students. Down 16.7%. So we're actually down at these two schools more than we are district-wide. We're down 10% district-wide. The reason for that is because of kindergarten. Usually Mark Twain has about 120 kindergartners. This year we have about half that because a lot of families have obviously decided not to start their kids' K-12 careers in an online environment. So what we did was we downloaded all of our data for this year, which is 647 students. 82 of those students are outside the boundary, either inside Silver Falls School District boundary, but outside of these school boundaries, or some that are coming from another district. And what we're going to focus on in my later presentation is we took of the 647, we took the 565 students that live within the boundary of those schools and plotted those as far as where they live. And what we agreed upon was that should be a big enough sample size to clearly articulate where the splits are, based on where kids are living. Obviously, we're short compared to last year, but if the work group decided, hey, next meeting, let's take a look at what the data was last year and make sure that whatever scenarios we're looking at, reconcile, so to speak, to scenarios that we're honing in on, we could certainly do that as well.
Any other questions around building size, capacity, and discussions we're going to have moving forward? Okay. We're at about 10 minutes to 7. I think that's probably close enough, Rob, to open up and go through the public comment process and see if we have any tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm glad I said it might be 6:50 when I was saying that earlier. So we're right on it. And I just going to read the script that gets read at the board meeting. So the board encourages citizens to share their ideas, opinions, raise questions, concerns, or complaints. If you wish to speak tonight, you can email a request to feedback@silverfalls.k12.or.us, or you can use the chat feature to request to speak on Zoom, and the person working with the media here will let you in. Remember that we all model the way for our students and ask that you share your thoughts in a respectful way. Anyone providing public testimony is required to state their name and address. All public testimony is limited to 3 minutes for each individual. Up to 5 minutes may be granted to groups of 3 or more with similar testimony. Please identify your group and designate one spokesperson. Due to time constraints, the maximum amount of public testimony is 10 individuals. When called, please state your name, relationship to the district, place of residence, and the subject you wish to address. The board won't hear personal complaints concerning district personnel or against any person connected to the school system. Public input from an individual should be new information only. Those repeating previous testimony will not be allowed to continue. And I think that is it. Again, use the chat feature on Zoom or email feedback@silverfalls.k12.or.us. And we'll open up to public comment now.
So I am monitoring that email address and chat as well. I haven't seen anything yet, but we'll give folks a minute.
Okay, yeah, we'll give it at least 2 minutes here. So it's 6:52, it's 6:54. We'll have public testimony, we'll move on. So if you have something to take care of, this is a good time. I'm always surprised at how long 2 minutes is when you're just sort of, waiting. About 10 more seconds here. Okay. Very good. Move forward.
We'll go ahead and move forward. There's always, having public comment is great. When you don't have it, you always kind of wonder, wait a minute, what's going on? A lot of times that means everything's going well, or you put people in charge that you trust. And we've got a really good and comprehensive group here. And I'm going to trust that it's the second one. They put you in charge and they trust you to make good decisions. We also haven't put out a scenario that actually drew lines. Oftentimes that brings some interest in public comment once they see where they are as opposed to others. So we'll continue having and offering public comment at every work group meeting that we have. Next section that we're going to go through, if Derek, you could pull up the PowerPoint I have, is about the criteria prioritization. I sent out to you some the criteria that we had talked about, and I asked you to prioritize that criteria. And so I heard back from all of you. I also did the same thing with the district office leadership team, because I wanted to know kind of where they stood and if they were thinking the same as the work groups thinking. And so we'll talk about both those. But first, let's go back and look, if you go to the next slide, let's go back and look at what the community said in the surveys that we put out. So the biggest concerns the community have, just to remind you, was the perception of one school being better than the other. 56 different people said, I'm really concerned that we're going to have a haves and a have-nots, that we're going to have a school that everybody wants to go to, and if you don't go there, you're going to feel like you're missing out. And so that was a big concern. The second one was splitting up friends, families, and neighborhood. And then everything after that, or most of the things after that, were about balancing your demographics within the school, student equity and diversity, resources and programs you offer, socioeconomic status, and class size. Next slide. Also in the community survey, we asked what the most important criteria for the committee to consider would be. And the number one response there from the community was, we need to make sure that class size is taken into account. You don't want, you know, classes that are huge. And I think everybody'd be fine if class sizes were even, if they're all smaller. They don't want all the classes being big, and they don't want some classes being big and some classes being small. That they want some balance there. And that was their top priority. Then there are 4 things that were very close together. That was keeping neighborhoods together, balancing diversity, safety of travel, and the distance that students live from school. And so those were just a quick review of what we heard from the community in the survey results. So what did you guys tell me? As I surveyed you, you filled out, prioritized from 1 to 9, the 9 different criteria that we had listed. And this is what you had to say, and let me explain what our numbers mean. So the top choice, the most important thing to this work group, as far as our criteria was concerned, were that schools have capacity to serve the students in the boundary. That average, if you voted at number 1, it got 1 point, and number 9 got 9. It averaged 4.14. This is golf, so low score wins. It averaged 4.14. What it had was 3 people who said it was the most important thing, and 1 person who said it was the least important thing. That's what that 3 and 1 is on the right side of the screen. The really interesting thing about that is that we had 9 items. 7 of them had a first place vote, and 8 of them had a last place vote. And so there was a whole lot of different thoughts and ideas in here. And I think there's some reasons behind it. We'll have the opportunity to discuss some of those. But capacity for some who I talked to, so I had some dialogue around this, some felt that school capacity was just a given. It's not something I have to put down as a priority, because obviously we're going to look at whether or not the school can hold the number of students that we believe are going to go there. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. And yet, you know, I think that's why it slid to the bottom of some lists, because obviously when we start talking about schools, the 55-45 split, the number of students that can fit in the schools, school capacity is truly something that we have to address. It makes sense that it came out as the top priority, because it is probably the first thing that you, as you start drawing lines, first thing it has to be done. The second thing that you as a work group said was balancing student equity and diversity. It was actually fairly close to school capacity. Didn't have a lot of first or last place votes, but it by average, those were clearly the top 2 decisions. Third most important was balancing class size, and that's consistent with what the community has said. Fourth was balancing socioeconomic status. Those were very, very close together. In fact, balancing socioeconomic status had more first place votes. And then there was a little bit of a break, and we got down to keeping neighborhoods together. Solutions that work now and into the future, that was one that people really, they liked or they didn't, or they understood or they didn't. That kind of goes along with that school capacity. And what I hope you trust right now, what we've come to a place to trust, Rob and I and the leadership team, is that as we do this work based on the growth that we've talked about, based on what Jason shared tonight, we believe that there's not going to be drastic increases in student population in Silverton proper. And therefore, we believe that the school capacities we have should, if we draw it right this time, should be good for quite a while. Unless something weird happens, we believe that's true. Down at number 7 was safety of travel to schools. Number 8 was balancing sped needs. And number 9 was travel distance to school. And so I asked a couple people, so how can travel distance to school be something that's not that important? And what I came to understand was that the radius around a school, the walking distance from a school, it's important to those students. But as you get out of town, the distance to one school or the other really doesn't matter at all. In fact, if you're south of town, you're going to drive in and you're going to turn right or you're going to turn left. Really won't matter a whole lot as to which school you go to from there. If you're standing, if you're just outside the door of Robert Frost and you're an elementary student, at that point, distance matters. And so for this group of students, this radius of however big that is, it matters. And for everybody else, it really doesn't. So those are the results of the work group. Now let's switch to the next slide. And I'll show you the results of the leadership team when I asked them the exact same thing. And on the right, so on the left and in the order, you'll see how the district leadership team prioritized those. The number in parentheses on the right is what the work group had prioritized those as. And the number on the far right, the plus or minus number, is how different it was. Everything that does not have a number on there was only 1 or 2 spots different. So for most of them, it was very consistent. The leadership team felt like balancing equity and diversity was the most important for them. They also, in that case, talked about the schools having the capacity as just kind of a given, just kind of an obvious something that we had to do. And so they prioritized equity and diversity first, socioeconomic status second, balancing sped needs third. And that's first place that we have a fairly drastic difference between the two groups and how they looked at this. There was five spots different in that case. Then balancing class size, safety of travel to school, keeping neighborhoods and areas together. Travel distance was number 7. And then school capacity we talked about, and the solutions at work now and into the future. So that's kind of what it looked like from the leadership team. Also a very good list. There isn't a right or a wrong in any of these things. It's just kind of what you put as a priority or the most important thing as we go forward. And hopefully we're going to address all of these things when we draw our boundaries. But it's important to know if push comes to shove, what it is that we're going to put our thumb on and say, no, this is the one that has to win out. So let's switch to the next slide. So this is basically the same slide as what the work group put together. I'm going to use this as a discussion starting point. The only difference here is the class size, socioeconomic status is switched around. And that again was based on conversations and how close it was. I think what we have to decide now as a group is, where do we go here? Do you want to talk about, or we can talk about each one and advocate for moving items up and down as need be? So I wanted to throw out a whole bunch of information before we go on from here.
And Randy, we had a question in the chat that asked, what do we mean by class size? Do we mean how big a classroom, how many kids are in a classroom, or do we mean class size like by the class of, say, 2027?
Right. Yeah, and we didn't articulate that one way or the other. And so it could have meant something for one person and something different for somebody else. We just simply said class size. Now, most people, I think when they think of class size, they think of how many are going to be in their class, their kids' class, their student count, and so forth. One of the things you'll see as we continue through with different scenarios is it's very hard to draw boundaries that have the right number of students in each school and also have the exact right number of students in each grade level at each school. That just is very, very difficult to do. And that'll be one of the challenges as we go through this process. Okay. Questions and comments about or advocation for any of these moving from where the list you see on the screen is, and I can only see 4 or 5 of you over there, so speak up.
I have a question.
Okay.
I'd actually like to hear from someone that was on the admin team that had the SPED needs higher than the rest of the committee. As a not an educator, to me that seemed like a no-brainer that those schools would just have the same, but obviously the admin team doesn't think that, so I want to know why they had it so high.
So who would like to speak to that?
Leslie, I'm happy to answer that, but would you like to take that one?
How about I'll start and then you can finish it. I think, Melissa, part of our discussion really surrounded our listening sessions that we had with the staff. And we really heard from the staff of each school that they were really passionate about having 2 schools that were equal. And some of the Robert Frost discussion was around, well, if we are still hosting these 3 district-wide special education programs, then we're going to have a different student population than Mark Twain. And so we really heard that loud and clear from that staff. And so we really wanted to honor that in our ranking. And Scott, do you have another perspective?
Well, yeah, and I would add on top of that, that when we talk about, balancing equity and diversity, I mean, we really mean that we're also balancing inclusion and inclusiveness. And so I think, we feel it's very important that our kids who are receiving special education services have access to general education programs, not just in one building, but in both. Our special education director is here with us. Dana, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think Leslie said it, very well. I from a special education department point of view, I know that we really want to make sure that every student in the district has adequate support in every building. Robert Frost has done an amazing job of hosting our 3 inclusive classroom settings. It's a lot to ask one building to do, and I honestly think that other buildings, Robert Frost, they get the benefit of those buildings, and that those children form peer relationships and understandings about kids with different kinds of needs. And I think that's a benefit to every kid in our district. And so we would like to see, hopefully, 1 or 2 of those programs be moved to possibly Mark Twain, if that works out. But I think too, just for staffing, it's a whole new experience. I know for some of our K-8 buildings, having a student with significant needs, they just don't come around. Usually they are in town, or historically we have done that and drawn separate programs. So we just want to make sure, again, that equity and experience is out there for not only staff, but opportunity for kids.
Okay. Thanks for the question, Melissa. Any other questions about specific ones on this list and moving those up or down?
I did. I won't say, I have trouble pointing to one specific. I can give an example, but I just want to share some feedback if anyone, and question if anyone else had difficulty like I did in this list. And for me, I had trouble identifying the list of attributes that I would want to have at both schools versus the list of attributes that are needed for a boundary decision. And so I think it's okay if those two lists don't look the same when we talk about what are the things that are the criteria that's needed for changing the boundaries around. May not look exactly as far as the same list for attributes that we would want to have at both schools. So one of those examples, and just from my own perspective, the keeping the neighborhoods together or the solutions that work now and into the future, for me would bump up on that list above some of the other criteria that I would say could be more fluctuating. For example, the balancing the diversity and equity of students. That may be really tough when we're looking at single family houses. We're looking at those houses for today. What is the makeup of the students in those houses today? And that may be different from 2 to 3 years from now. I'm not saying that those attributes aren't valuable, but for making boundary decisions, we may want to think through that as far as what criteria that we have up towards the top of the list may be one of those fluctuating data points that is going to be a hard number to match and consistently get year in and year out if we want to think through that from a long-term perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I also think it brings up the idea that a lot of the things we'll decide on are based on the data that's now, and it will change and it will morph over the course of time. And you just can't help that, and you can't foresee exactly where that's going to be and how that's going to change. I think one of the things, and I told Scott and Steve the other day, one of the things that really gives me comfort in this process is Steve talked about those 80 students that are from other areas in your district or even outside of the district. And one of the things that allows you to do is that allows you to balance schools in a different way, because as somebody's asking to come into a school, you have more flexibility to say, yes, that works here. No, that doesn't work over here. And that in a lot of settings that don't have the outlying schools like you guys have, they don't have those choices. And so that makes me much more comfortable in where we're going as a committee with this group, because I think what doesn't work and has to be tweaked down the road, you have the tools you need to be able to tweak it. Other thoughts and questions, discussions? I see that hand. I don't see any. Kristen?
Yes, so back to the SPED point, number 8 being for the focus group here. I do think that needs to be thought about bumping up on the list, because not only is it beneficial to our SPED students and our regular education population, but with those programs you get all of the specialists in your building as well, and that adds a lot of value. They're accessible to gen ed teachers and to training opportunities, and I think as a whole that would create an inequity if they were all in one building as they are now.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kristen. I know that at least in Tillamook, where I was, almost all of our educational assistants were special ed assistants. That's where our funding was. That's where we have the capacity to be able to add bodies. And title didn't give that, and general didn't give that near as much as what the others did. So I think that's a really good point. So you're advocating for trying to bump that up this list of ways. Okay.
Yes.
Dave?
I was just going to make a comment. So I'm in agreement on the SPED needs comment, and my next comment is not related to that program in specific, but just the number 2 being the balance of some of these programs. I do want to recognize from my work, I see organizations that say if we can't do it everywhere, we won't do it at all. And so I also think that's discussion of what's good for the district when, for some other programs, if a school wants to take on another special program, that there is still that flexibility for those schools to do those, where maybe it wouldn't be at both schools, maybe just one school has that capacity, because we are talking about two schools with different capacities. They have different room sizes, and I don't say we are, but just making the note that saying that they're both equal and they're going to be both doing the same things for most of those programs is also something to consider thinking through.
Yeah, and some of those decisions are obviously going to be a district decision based on capacity, based on funding, based on programs, and at some point, I don't know if you have a dual language program at this point, and if you do, how big that is. But that'd be an example of a program that you would love to have in both buildings, and yet maybe you can only find staffing to run it in one building, something like that. So that's part of the manager, district leadership's job, is to try to figure out how to balance that as you go along. Other thoughts or questions on the criteria discussion? So I heard Kristen.
I have one, sorry.
Okay.
Joni. Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit curious, and I think you kind of touched on this, and I don't know if admin wants to speak to this more, but we have the one about, for number one, the schools have capacity to serve students in their boundary. And I guess speaking from a staff perspective, part of my reason why that's really high for me is that I started out at Eugene Field and got moved to Mark Twain. And the truth is we don't have the capacity to be there. So we did a move where we didn't have the capacity to be in that building. So to me, it is really important to keep that in the forefront of like making sure that we have the capacity in the building. That's why to me, that was so important. So I'm just curious from the admin perspective where they put that down the list, like, oh, that's a given, but it wasn't really a given when we moved buildings. Does that make sense before? I don't know.
Sure. So anybody like to tackle that one or address that?
Yeah, I can't speak to the historical context. I didn't know that, Joni. So is there someone on my team that has any background knowledge of that?
Well,
Steve,
yeah.
Go ahead, Leslie. You were here, I wasn't.
I was going to say it's Steve or I, huh?
Well, I think it was just a matter of, well, this is my 6th year. So was it our first year, Leslie? This is both of our 6th year. It was our first year, was the last year at Eugene Field.
Yeah,
The decision,
was. And that was the crazy year at Robert Frost where we had.
The decision had been made, and I think it was kind of a forced matter, obviously, to get out of Eugene Field due to safety and wellness of students and staff, along with the fact that then full day K was starting up. So what Eugene Field was a K3 and transitioned to a K2, and since the bond failed, obviously there had to have been a stopgap in there somewhere, but the decision was made that Mark Twain was then going to become the elementary. And then that was it the first year there or second year that Robert Frost went through three different grade configurations in 3 consecutive years due to all those changes with regards to moving to full day K and the 3rd graders moving up. And then the change going Eugene Field to Mark Twain, and then the formation of Silverton Middle School instead of just a junior high. So I think it was, it all started with the moving to full day K and having to move out of Eugene Field. So I think it was more, there just wasn't the luxury, I suppose, of being able to deal with that capacity situation.
So, and Randy, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but it was my sense when we talked to leadership that when they looked at the list, they felt like school capacity and long-term solution were self-evident. Like that has to happen. We couldn't make a decision that the schools don't have the capacity now and into the near-term future to handle. And so I think it just sort of fell to the bottom of the list because it was self-evident, and I don't think it was an intent to say, let's do this and overcrowd a school. That wouldn't be acceptable, nobody at all. Although it sounds like maybe 6 or 7 years ago that might have happened a little bit, and so I understand the concern.
Yeah, I kind of just
think-
felt from my standpoint, just kind of being an accounting nerd here, I was just like, well, it has to start there, and then let's rank the rest of the list, because we can't overflow the builder.
Well, and I think we'd have a whole different conversation if we had 850 kids in this boundary right now that we're trying to figure out how to divide, knowing that we didn't have enough room to put them combined in the two buildings. And then we'd start having different discussions about those, the K-8 schools and the impact on those and moving kids in and out. Right now, because of where we are in our attendance, we feel like we have the capacity. We feel like we'll have it based on our demographic study as we move forward. And so I think school capacity, as you see our scenarios that we put together as some start to options, that was something that was kind of our starting point. We need to have whatever students we have, 55% of them over here and 45% of them over here, or somewhat close. And then we believe the school size is going to work out. And if it doesn't down the road, then there's going to have to be adjustments made. Would anybody like to speak about any of these others specifically before I kind of wrap this up and we move on to looking at some maps?
I can talk about something here.
Okay.
To go on the Joni with the capacity, I rated it higher because of how Robert Frost was overcrowded 6 years ago. And it was just not safe for the kids in that scenario. But with that, if we keep that like number one, capacity, that could essentially affect the special needs. Because of numbers, it could affect where special needs classrooms are housed, either at Mark Twain or Robert Frost. Right now, they're mostly at Robert Frost. My guess is because of capacity issues at Mark Twain. So that's something to look at.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things you're talking about there is capacity of building and program capacity, and the combination of those two and how they fit together in this scenario. I think what we have here is a good kind of overview. I agree that special ed could easily move up. Let's look, I'm going to leave this where it is for right now, and I may end up, as we look at different scenarios, tell you that I'm going to survey you again and give you the opportunity to respond on criteria. I think a lot of these are kind of going to play together as we start looking at numbers down the road. And so I'm going to move forward and move to Steve's going to do a presentation. They've done a lot of work over the course of the last couple weeks to get to a place to where we have some pretty good mapping and so forth. And so we're going to get to that here shortly. Rob?
I would just say, if you do decide to, it makes some sense to me to survey again, perhaps. But I do think it'd be great to look at the maps. If we do decide to survey again, I think we need to set a couple rules around it. Like what do we mean specifically, or where are we with the idea of long-term capacity and school balance? And then also what class size means specifically.
Right.
Okay.
And so
quick thing about Kyle's comment. Just going back to that Eugene Field to Mark Twain transition, that's exactly what happened. We had basic skills at Mark Twain, and we had one other SPED classroom at Mark Twain. And when we moved to Mark Twain, we lost all of our SPED rooms. So that is exactly what happened. It has nothing to do with, it's just, there's literally no classrooms to put them in right now.
That's right.
What happened?
Is it, and you're saying now, it's still that way, not it was that way 6 years ago?
When we moved, we lost both of our SPED rooms. We lost music because we didn't have capacity to have a music classroom. I want to say that's it. So 2 SPED rooms and a music, I believe.
Okay. Sounds like a good time to reorganize. Okay, Dave.
Just one last comment, just so I'm clear, because I may be misunderstanding, but after looking at that list, initially I was looking at them as competing priorities. So I was seeing like, I really need to really put number 3 up a little higher and 2 down and 4 up and 6. And so after hearing some of the discussion, I'm somewhat saying I would agree leaving them where they're at currently as well. And I'm not seeing them now as competing priorities, but more of a list that it sounds like we're going to be able to achieve all of them. And I think that's a good point to bring up, that if there are some discussions later, we may be discussing things that are more outside of the boundary criteria discussion. And so some of the points on ranking them may not make it for, are needed for the actual boundary decisions. So I just wanted to make that note that I was hearing others maybe think of these as competing priorities as we rank them as well.
And truly, if we get lucky, we meet all of those. You know, it divides evenly. It's beautiful. It has the right number of kids on both sides, and they're going to stay there for the next 10 years. And that may not happen, but you know, ideally, we're going to meet as many of those as possible. There may come a point to where we have to decide here or here on something, but those are going to be small nuances by the time we get there. So
I'm sorry to be that. And can I go one?
Thanks for being that person, Joni. I appreciate it.
Want to go back to when Leslie was going through the buildings. Just to clarify, Leslie, and this is just from Mark Twain perspective since I teach there. When you said we have 2 small group spaces, just to clarify and so that everybody understands what that means, do you mean our locker rooms?
Yeah, Greg sent me a map and he wrote down 2 small group spaces, so I copied it. So Greg might have to comment on that, but I think he was talking about the locker rooms, perhaps?
Yeah. Everyone, our school was a middle school and they have converted our 2 locker rooms off of the gym into small group spaces. Now, I guess, yes, you can call it that, but ideal classroom, even as a small group space, to be honest, like they're working in a locker room, and that's the honest truth. They've got shower rooms that are, you know, curtained off, and it's not an ideal learning space even for a small group. So just to clarify that when we call it 2 spaces. So
one of them is our title intervention services, so our students go down there and receive their additional support in reading and math in one of those. And then the other one is because of the younger population, we have a sensory room. So we have specific sensory equipment to provide an outlet for students to give them a little bit of a break and give them some needs as kind of they arise. So both of those areas are used, and that was what Leslie had wrote in her report as small classroom spaces or small spaces.
Okay. Excellent. I can envision that in my head. I have lived that life. And so very good. Appreciate that. Okay, we're going to move on to Steve, and he's got a presentation with a whole bunch of little dots on it. So Steve.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you everyone for your excellent input. So we've been working since the last meeting very hard with Forecast 5 Analytics on their 5 Maps tool. We're still learning really how to use it, and so they really help us while we're training on the tool. They're really helping us put together what we need, since this process is needing to keep moving along at a quick pace. And so I want to also thank Sharon Etzel, Debbie Veloff, and Alex Johnson for helping with this work, along with Randy and Rob and admin staff. We were able to get data loaded and vetted out, and then get our maps built in, and school locations and our boundaries and those types of things, our current boundaries for all the schools, because there's a lot of different things we could use this for in the future. But what we did was we just kind of looked at where the data landed, where the students are living, and started to look at what could possibly work just based on the geography. And so we did come up with, we had a couple of starting points, and then we came up with a couple of scenarios, and these are obviously just some out of the gate thoughts and ideas, and we're going to want obviously input and feedback from you, and we could develop other scenarios off of this. So it's just really a starting point for conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Fortunately, we were able to get through, let's see here, this one here, okay. Everyone's seeing the slide we already looked at, is that correct? The capacity slide?
Yes.
So we were able to get through a lot of the basic data about the download of this year's data and what the numbers usually are compared to this year and all of that. So I'm not going to go back over that, but the first slide I'm going to show you here is basically, this is just a map of, can everyone see my pointer jumping around here? Okay, good. So this is a plot of all of the current, well, of the 647 students I mentioned at the two schools. This is a plot of all the Mark Twain and Robert Frost students and where they're coming from. So you can clearly see where these 80 plus kids are coming from outside the boundaries. Next, we show that this boundary here is the combined boundaries of Robert Frost and Mark Twain as they sit today, with a little bit more of a drill down view of the students. You still see some of the kids outside the boundary. So our focus with this data will be the 565 students that live within this dark area or the boundaries of the two schools. Robert Frost is green and Mark Twain is blue. Now, of course, we're looking at blue pins are K2 students, and green are the 3-5. Now, the pins could include more than one student there. Sometimes there's multiple students within that. So the first thing that we did back in December, after we got the data loaded, was we just thought, well, let's think of this as simplistic as possible and just kind of start with that and see where it goes. And so what we did initially was we just said, well, what if we kind of went down 213? Now, we couldn't stick on 213 all the way through because Mark Twain and Robert Frost would have been within the same boundary, the buildings themselves. So we kind of had to lift that and then kind of work our way through town. As you can see, the numbers clearly don't work. We ended up with 183 at Robert Frost and 382 at Mark Twain. So we said, well, let's move along. So then we said, well, what about 214? Well, that doesn't work either. You can see if you just drop it right on through that a vast majority of the students are living on the Mark Twain side of that line. So then we started to think about a different way to go about this. And what we did was we looked at 214 north of town as being kind of an important dividing line just from a neighborhood and safety kind of perspective. And you can see how much population there is there. And I think, I don't think I've said this yet, but I think one of the starting points for any boundary scenario is 184 students of Mark Twain. And I have a picture and a few slides here that shows this, that would be in this boundary as K5 students, live within a half mile of Mark Twain. 184 students. So if we were looking at, of this 565 student scenario, let's say the target is 248 of these 565 at, say, 44, 45%. That that means that 74% of the of that target number live within a half mile of Mark Twain. So that's a real important fact to state right from the start. So this particular scenario that we've labeled scenario A keeps the dividing line north of town at 214, and then it kind of cuts in here a little bit, and we're going to go to the more detailed. So you can see down this way, everything down Water Street, including Pioneer, all feeds to Robert Frost. So as you get into this little middle area here, that's harder to determine on that broader slide, you can kind of see where it's carved out here. It's carved out at I believe it's B Street over to Hill, and there's a carve out here that would feed to Robert Frost. Now this little group in here is still about 0.5 miles from Mark Twain, but as the crow flies, Mark Twain and Robert Frost are about a mile or slightly over a mile away, so they're not very far from each other, obviously. So clearly, these are all walking students. This isn't, I know, quite as easy to walk to Mark Twain from, so we kind of cut in here to try to get some more numbers over to Robert Frost. Up here, obviously, this is the Abaquaw Heights area, so that access is from Oak Street, so not Water. So we wanted to keep that neighborhood within the Mark Twain population. So let's go back to the broader view there, and then back to the close-up view. Now this next slide is going to show you that 0.5 mile radius situation. You can clearly see that we have a lot more students living within 0.5 miles of Mark Twain than we do Robert Frost. So that's where some of this cutout came in, and I think this is an area in this scenario that could be, examined and discussed. And then obviously to get to get enough students to Robert Frost, we had to take all of Water Street and go to Robert Frost there. So that's where we landed in scenario A.
I think you also kind of talked about if you live down Water Street and you're going to get on Water Street and head north.
Yes.
You can turn right or turn left
Yep.
to go to the two schools, and that probably is how you would do that. Is that correct?
Yeah, you come into the center of town and you're pretty much right in between the two schools. So it's a situation where we wouldn't have anyone driving by one school to go to another. It would just be, are we going left or are we going right? So that's scenario A. Now let's look at some statistics in terms of the demographics. So you can see on this slide, I did put over here that that stat that 184 students live within 0.5 miles of the school itself. And that's also reflected in scenario B. So Mark Twain specifically, if we look at the student data in this scenario, scenario A, you can see that free and reduced lunch students, we have close to 40% at Mark Twain and just over 33% at Robert Frost. Special ed education students, 14% to about 12%. English language learner students, right around, both around 9%. And then as far as race and ethnicity, we have a Hispanic population of close to 22% at Mark Twain in this scenario, and just over 16% at Robert Frost, and Caucasian/other at just under 80% and just over 80%. And then there's grade by grade data. As Randy stated, this would be really hard to juggle, when you're drawing a boundary, but kindergarten split right down the middle. Now you can see total kindergarten population, I mentioned this earlier, 64. Usually we're double that. First grade jumps up quite a bit at Mark Twain, but it's a bigger class altogether, as you can see. And then the other grades are fairly balanced with the exception of fifth grade. So there's a little bit of imbalance there. There wouldn't be a lot we could do about that. I think that no matter what scenario we land on, this would be more of a year-to-year management situation between the schools and the principals and the staffing. So before we go to scenario B, are there any questions or any slides you want to jump back to on scenario A?
So Steve, one of the questions I had was just on the overall numbers. You listed the K-5 numbers there. That would be current students this year that are in those grades?
Correct.
Okay, so 5th grade will be moving on next year, right?
Correct.
Okay, and kinder, we have no idea what's going to happen to kinder across the state. Our guess is there's going to be a whole bunch of kindergartners this year that are kindergartners next year as well, but we'll see how that kind of plays out. We believe they're going to come back either as kinder or 1st graders. It's hard telling.
Right.
Other questions on scenario A, or if you want to go back to the map and kind of drill down as to places? This is when people usually start getting a little nervous, is when they see the line drawn on a map and see how it impacts me.
Well, I guess my thing is, I would really, and I know we don't have it for tonight, but for me personally, just because our numbers are so off in the district this year, I would really love to see this with last year's numbers, just to see, is it really the same split? Because we just, without looking at that, we don't know. And I know we can't see that tonight, but I don't know if that's something that we can see. I think it would be worth looking. Do the numbers split the same way, given last year when we didn't really have all the COVID, decline?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's
good.
I think that's really fair to ask, and that will also tell us whether or not our belief of the 55-45 split holds true.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Randy,
Other questions?
I was just going to say, I also would love to see, and this is where kind of my thoughts originally talked about, where I talked about kind of more of the geographical boundaries, where I see some potential frustration from people within that boundary close to Mark Twain that would want their kids walking possibly, or being able to walk with them to school, and being in a different school configuration, different school. So thinking through that and raising that as a potential issue.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dave.
Other thoughts or questions on scenario A?
I've noticed that the current enrollment is 634 for this year, but the map is showing 565.
Yeah, so Leslie provided the data for the current school capacities with that current enrollment of the 346 and 288, which is based on today's numbers. The 647 that I started with was based on October 1st data, and we've decreased a little bit since then as the year has gone on. How we get back down to the 565 is, again, the difference between the 647 and 565 are the kids that live outside the boundary, the Robert Frost Mark Twain boundaries, in either inter or intra-district transfer students into these schools. So we just focused on the 565 that actually live within the boundaries.
Gotcha. And then a second question. I know you were having, like, the grade levels were kind of balanced, and like 4th grade I was seeing it was like the same. Now I don't know what the district is thinking on, like, how many grade levels at each school. There was a rumor of having like 3 grade levels at each school at Robert Frost and 2 at Mark Twain. But if the numbers are the same, that wouldn't be equal class sizes. So this is a tricky beast here.
Mm-hmm. Leslie, could you speak to that?
Sure. So we've realized that it's not going to be clear cut. And so there's going to have to be some sort of formula of a staffing formula of, we have a target class size. Let's say, for example, we want classes to be 25. So that means we'd have maybe 2 kindergarten classes and then 3 1st grade classes, because that's the student population we have to start with. And then we'd have to change it based on each year, you know, so I don't think Kyle or the whole team, it's going to be as clean cut as 2 and 3. It's going to be, here's what we have and here's the formula that we're going to use to staff that. Does that make sense?
It also is just kind of the nature of the beast. When you had all of your grade level, say first grade classes in one building, it was very easy to balance that. This has lots of advantages to go to this structure. Balancing class sizes is not one of them.
Yeah.
And never will be. It just doesn't work out that way. And so it's something you'll constantly be challenged with, and then there'll be questions of, do we have to do blends? How do we add here and not add there? I mean, all that because you guys have small schools out in your community. And so there's going to be some of those challenges through this process.
So is that something the district is talking about, is blends or teachers moving from year to year to different schools?
That was me talking. I don't want to throw that on the district at all. I just know going through this, we had to have those conversations when we did the exact same thing. So
Mark Twain, I mean, we've changed every year. I don't know if it's like that at Robert Frost or not, but we literally flex teachers every year. We flex from having blends and not blends. Teachers have changed grade levels. Every year I've been there, we've had that issue. Unfortunately, my hope was that when we made this switch, some of that would balance out. So it kind of feels like, no, we're going to be in the same situation. I don't know. I mean, I've had, we've had 2 or 3 teachers in the building be blend teachers. I know we have kinder teachers that are specialists now, because every year our numbers are like that, even with K2. So.
And Joni, I was superintendent in Tiger Tualatin for a long time, and our average elementary school size was 600. So we had a couple that were 750, and it was every year. It was still just the problem is, now instead of having it be 63 kids, it's 112. And what do you do with 112? And so if they would just show up in the exact right number, we'd be in great shape, but it just doesn't happen. And one of the things I worry about as we look at this, and that we haven't talked about, is that next year, and there's nothing to be done about this, by the way, but next year, there's going to be a bunch of kindergartners because some parents are not going to have started their kids. And that class is going to come through these schools as first graders, second graders, third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders. And it's going to cause teachers to have to do some changing about what they're teaching in order to be able to accommodate them all the way through our elementary schools for the next 6 years. And I hate to tell you that, because I know how hard it is to, my mom and my wife and my sister all taught elementary schools. And I don't, I'll be in trouble if I don't acknowledge how hard it is to change grades and do that work. But I'm afraid it's going to happen some over the next 5 or 6 years just because of COVID.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're in for a ride for probably the next 5 years with that. And truly, from the, lower elementary level teaching, I'd rather have a small class size and have to flex, honestly, than have a massive class size and not flex the teachers.
Yeah, these discussions we're having back when I first started as superintendent, it didn't really matter because our class sizes fluctuated from 15 to 19. You can fluctuate percentage-wise there and be fine. But when you start fluctuating from 25 to 32, the game's a whole lot different. And so it is kind of what we've grown accustomed to, sadly. Any other questions, thoughts, or comments on scenario A?
Yeah, I have a question really quick. So when I'm looking at these numbers, and more specifically for Mark Twain, when I look at these numbers and I think, okay, looking at this, if it was a real, like if this year was a real year, let's say that you double the number of kindergartners, since we've got about half. And I'm assuming that when Leslie just said that the target is about 25, the kindergarten target is closer to 20 across the district. That's kind of what we've always been told. So when you look at just kind of the number of classrooms, we're already to a minimum of 14 classrooms. And that's kind of where we're at now. So that doesn't leave any room for, you know, how we talked about trying to get a SPED program there, like that's already full. So it would seem to me like we got to get a few more kids to Robert Frost than we have at Mark. I mean, there's not a big enough difference to do anything different than we're doing right now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Aaron, I appreciate you relating that to the room capacities or number of rooms there, because that was I think maybe the biggest drawback of this scenario is that the balance just isn't quite right. It's more of a 52-48, I think it was, and yes, it felt a little light on Robert Frost and a little heavy on Mark Twain, for sure. So I felt the same way.
But that's also a very good point, because you have to look at how they're divided, and then you have to logistically, the district leadership has to logistically see how it would actually play out in that building as far as classes are concerned, to know if it does work. And so, you know, the overall number might be good. The makeup of those numbers may not be as good. So let's go on to scenario B, the Pac-Man scenario. And
yes, the big reveal. Yeah, kind of labeled this one the Pac-Man scenario. It ended up with 303 at Robert Frost and 262 at Mark Twain. So 54% and 46%, which is closer to what we were looking at. So this one is, kept, this area was about the same here, but in town, but it did take, and this, again, this line may not be right, but it kind of wrapped around up here to the north and grabbed some students east of 214 to the north, figuring, and we could be wrong about this thought, but just an idea, maybe families wouldn't mind, you know, hey, let's just drive out to First Avenue here and drive on out and go to Robert Frost, and maybe they're a little far away for what they'd want to do for walking. So I grabbed that. That's a change. There was also a bit of a change down Water Street here. There's a little bit of it doesn't go right down Water Street. There's a bit of a carve out to the you know, kind of a little bit of change in the line here that takes some students into Robert Frost, I believe, compared to Mark Twain in the last scenario, or excuse me, vice versa. So if you drill down on it, it doesn't go far enough to the south, and that's something that we'll have to provide, because these are just screenshots. I'm not in the program at the moment. So there's some differences here, and but the thing that I think that really are kind of guiding us geographically are the fact that we have a lot of folks, you know, living within a half mile of Mark Twain, and the only way to get the Robert Frost numbers up is that this group down Water and into Pioneer really have to be directed to Robert Frost, just from a general standpoint. So again, here in this scenario, we were able to keep this group in here that was going to Robert Frost in scenario A in the Mark Twain boundary, but we did grab some students up here that were in Mark Twain in scenario A and had them go to Robert Frost in scenario B. So the way the data breaks out student-wise here is, in either scenario, we did pretty well with the balancing of the demographics with regards to equity and diversity. We did get more numbers into Robert Frost with scenario B. Of course, I think there's going to be some areas that we could look at to say, well, you know, could we look at this little area of town differently or what have you? And these maps are just a starting point for that conversation for sure. But that's kind of how it ended up. And as far as the grades, fairly similar. Again, we have that difference in grade 5. They'll be out into the middle school next year. Other than that, it was fairly similar. So I'd be happy.
Any questions on scenario B and thoughts on that? Numbers, if you go back a screen, Steve, to the demographic information. When I first saw this, I thought, wow, that's really good for just drawing lines down roads and trying to balance that out. There's a lot of things on there that are really good. So,
Randy,
question?
could I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
I just want to mention to the work group that, you know, in listening to your conversations, and it's great, I just want to make sure that we're really clear on who's making the decision here on these boundaries. And the ones making the decision on this boundary is you as a group. We've come up with viable options just to help with the process. We have really sophisticated software, but I just want to make sure that everybody's clear that ultimately it will be your decision as a group. And if you feel strongly enough that there needs to be adjustments made, please understand the influence that you have over this decision. And that's the entire way that we design the process. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Thanks, Scott. So the scenarios that are up there, you've been able to see, and they'll be posted. This PowerPoint will be posted along with everything else on the website. So you'll be able to dig back into them a little bit more. I guess what I'd like to know now is other ideas, thoughts, adjustments, things we ought to try. One of those we've already talked about is loading the student population from a year ago so we have a greater population, see how that divides compared to how it does for this year. But any other different lines, directions, things like that you'd like Steve or 5 Maps to kind of put in there and figure out if it would work demographically?
I do.
Okay, Dave?
Just, I didn't get a good detailed look at the smaller views, but just thinking of the community aspect, I'll just share my own perspective and the disclaimer that this doesn't apply to me because I feel my community is cohesive, and in both examples it's together. But just being somebody new that came into the district and going to a school, I think, you know, thinking about our schools and community, I mean, that's fairly high in importance to me. And I think something that we want to have at the schools when we talk about PTC group. I mean, that was one of the big discussions that was brought forward with the K-5 discussion, was being able to have a sense of community to the school and to be able to community with people around you. I would be heartbroken if my kids were going to a different school than those that are somebody that the kids that are right across the street. So just taking a more of a detailed look at those scenarios and those situations, if we do have any of those communities that may be broken or split. And I'm not able to say and take a look at the map right now, but just thinking through that to have a second look at that, just to be able to say that we've seen those potential issues and we've somehow addressed them in our boundary decisions.
Dave, just to clarify, you're not saying you've necessarily seen somewhere in there, right? I didn't know if you were saying there's a specific.
Correct. I haven't seen them. I just want to make sure that we go back and look at that just to verify that we can say that it's been thought through and we're catching any potential issues where we may have those situations.
And every scenario is going to have some of those situations, because anytime you have a line, you're going to have people on both sides of it. And so, but you try to minimize those. I think this view is a pretty good way to see that in this second scenario, scenario B, there's certainly some parts in town to where that line was drawn and all the kids are on the blue side as opposed to very close to the green side. It does a pretty nice job until you get up to the north part of it there on the outskirts of that walking, what we consider the walking area of that circle. Other thoughts or questions or suggestions? Other scenarios that you think we ought to look at, try, give a shot at, anything like that?
Are we, I know that we've talked about it a little bit. We are, I don't know where exactly we landed, but we are only looking at the boundaries that currently go to Mark Twain and Robert Frost, not kind of on the outskirts.
Yes, that's true at this point. And a lot of that was about capacity and whether or not we had the capacity. Again, I think if we looked and saw that there were too many kids to fit in our buildings here and had to change, then that's where you'd start talking about some of these kids that are up on the upper right hand side of your screen and where they might go or something like that. Also remember, like we said before, you have options that a lot of districts don't have, and the amount of transfers and movement within the district that you approve or don't approve. And so there is some control that the district can have on that.
So that was my other question too. When you look at the on that very first map that you showed that did have all the kids that are at others that are in other schools but that come in to the town schools.
The very first big one.
Yes, that one. So when you look at all those, I don't remember. But so what happens with those kids? Where do those kids go? Is there, I mean, you know what I mean? Is it, well, how does that work?
So who wants to answer that?
Well, there's a transfer process that occurs each year, and that's a discussion we need to have in terms of, it's almost like a reset the way I would see it. And Debbie, you've been involved with transfer. If you're still on, maybe you could speak to this, Debbie Baloff. But it, since it's a, obviously if it's a K2 request, then right now they're going to Mark Twain. If it's a 3-5 request, they're going to Robert Frost. But now, since both schools will be K5s, they're gonna, in my view, they would have to apply and go through a process and be routed to one school or the other. And we're gonna be able to, that's where we'll be able to gain some of that flexibility with however we end up with these boundaries. We say, well, how many can we take? And for balance with our different priorities, which school should they go to? But it's a great question, and it's a process that we need to talk about because it's a different process for in town now than it has been each year up to this point.
So for those kids, are we saying, the slate's going to be wiped clean just because you've, been approved to be at Mark Twain? Maybe you haven't made it yet to Robert Frost.
Right.
You're not necessarily going to be approved anymore.
Well,
is that?
I'm not gonna, that's a wonderful question. To me, just at the surface, that wouldn't seem to be right. If they were approved at Mark Twain and they're just going into first or second grade, it would seem that, it would be fair to let them stay. But we'd have to take a good look at the numbers to see,
I mean, that's what I'm asking. Like
Right.
That's a lot of kids.
Yeah, it is.
So,
and some are intra, which means they're coming from other parts of our school district, and some are inter, which means they're coming from outside of our school district. So that is a whole, I think, separate situation that we need to look at and develop criteria for sure. And I'm no spokesman here. I'm just thinking out loud, but I'm glad that you brought that conversation up because it's definitely something that we need to discuss further for sure.
And Aaron, make sure I don't speak out of turn on this, but I think what we've talked about here too is making some boundary decisions, and then that the committee would have an opportunity to make some other recommendations. And some of those recommendations are around transfer and so on. And it may be that there are some recommendations that are outside of the charge of the committee, but they can also be made for consideration, right? So I think that this is a really good place where you all could be thinking about, well, what about these kids? What set of thinking and rules would we want the district to consider for those?
it also leads us into the next part of our discussion, which can combine with what's on the screen right now. And that is, what are the areas that you as a work group want to at least have conversation about and possibly recommendations moving forward? One of those would be, what you do with existing students. Another one would be that we put down on the agenda a phase-in plan. What does that look like? And so any other things that you want to address, talk about, consider as a committee, once we kind of have some boundaries set, the logistics of how you make this transition work well. Thoughts and ideas?
Can I ask a question about the demographic stats? I'm wondering if the Caucasian/other, if the other did not comprise enough of a percentage point, is that why they were combined, or what is the breakdown of that?
Steve?
Yes, that is definitely some of it, but also the way that the flag is, the flags for ethnicity are tracked in the student information system. They're yes or no flags, and there can be up to, is it 3?
Yeah, you have to mark Hispanic or non-Hispanic first, and then once you do that, you can go down and mark other racial and ethnic selections. And so it's hard to filter through all of those. And so some of that is Hispanic, non-Hispanic, or other, Christine, because it's the system is pulling a complex question.
Yeah, and that's the way the data is extracted and then loaded into the 5 Maps program. And so that was the way we had to break that down when we tried to grab it.
So those are your options, is just to do it generally with those 2 categories.
Right.
Okay.
And then do I hear you saying, like, if we wanted to drill down further, we could, or no, we can't? Like, that's as far as we can drill down if we wanted to.
I believe the way the data is loaded into 5 Maps, I don't think we could do anything more with it. We could get more specific data from our student information system, I believe, based on our current enrollment with the way the schools are right now. Is that right, Leslie?
Yes.
But in terms of how they end up on the map, that would be a different story.
Okay, so question again on what is it that you as a committee believe you would want to have discussion about and possibly weigh in as we talk about boundaries, lines, and process to get from where you are today to where you're opening schools in a different structure next year? Long wait time. So one of them, let me tell you what I think you need to do. Personal choice. Should you as a district allow parents to choose which school they go to, or to choose to go to a school outside of their attendance boundary if they live in town? And do you want to weigh in on that as a committee, as a work group?
I think it would be nice to outline a process or
Okay.
some sort of structure to it, that took into account school capacity and those kinds of things, that didn't just say everyone can choose, but that somehow took into account what the school capacities already were, and then some sort of structure for making that decision at the administrative level.
So an application process, not that you close the door to it, but an application process that then could protect the integrity of the balance that you created by drawing the lines where you did. Okay. Other things that you think, wow, how are we going to do that? Or I hope the district does X. What are other things? So Courtney says, I like the current rules. If you want to apply to be at another school, you can, and they base it on availability. Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, I think we already have something similar because look, we have all the K-8s, obviously people already doing that in district. So it would seem like we already have structure in place to follow.
Right. A lot of times things come up around family. If you're going to apply as one, do I get, you know, my sister's over there, so do I now get to go over there as well? Things like that around the logistics of how you do that. If you want to weigh in again, maybe the district's so used to doing this that it won't be an issue as you move forward.
I think we actually even have like board policy and decision rules around transfers. It's pretty dictated.
Nice.
There's several principles in this call. Please speak up if I'm wrong, but it's pretty structured.
That, you know, Leslie, that process of the, you know, if there's room and applying, and that process is pretty solid. I know that I've had some recent conversations with Alex Johnson, who monitors the transfer process at the district office, as well as Debbie Baloff. And there, we do need to revisit a few of those policies, because one of the little situations that's happening right now is students in a school move or go outside of the attendance boundary. I can't remember exactly how it's worded, but there is some policy, and maybe, I don't know, Dan or somebody else, but there is some policy where that student can continue to attend the school that they left. So like if I have a student that leaves, they can continue to stay. And I can't remember how Debbie worded it, but it was a little confusing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
I believe it comes from ODE, that portion. If a student is attending school in our district and they move out of the district within that year or the summer leading into the next school year, we accept them. And that's not our own policy. I believe that comes from the ODE.
Okay, thanks, Debbie.
Maybe this is a school board policy issue that isn't related to us, but I do have some concerns about the choice and how it relates to equity, because I think that a lot of times families that can choose to take their student and drive them across town have a lot more opportunities than those families that can't do that. And so I worry that then we end up spreading or not spreading things out equally.
Right. And I think what you're saying is there has to be a gatekeeper to this. Otherwise, what you draw as a boundary may completely change based on what actually walks through the door, who actually walks through the door. And that's not good for anybody.
I think another thing to consider specifically for next year, I know of one family who has been at Mark Twain and has a third grader at Robert Frost. And because the third grader has never stepped foot in Robert Frost, is just having the hardest time. It's been incredibly traumatic for them. And looking at both of those scenarios, they would go to Robert Frost. And I feel like the parent is really hoping that, they can stay with Mark Twain just to kind of heal her kiddos stuff, you know what I mean? Because they're both very connected there, so I think that for next year, we have to use a little bit more kid gloves and be a little bit more lenient, just because of all the stuff the kids have been put through this year.
So the idea of a phase-in plan then, Aaron, is kind of what you're talking.
I I can kind of argue both sides, because I feel like, well, if we're going to have a big old phase-in plan, then what's the point of even doing boundaries? Because everybody's going to try to use it. But I do think that specifically for next year, we have to take into consideration what's gone on this year.
Yeah, like you said, I can see both sides, because I'm afraid if we take too much into account, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot for everything we put in place. And especially because we know the capacity at Mark Twain is smaller. We cannot accommodate every person that wants to stay at Mark Twain, or we'll be back in the same situation. You know, there has to be some sort of structure to be able to say no, even though no sucks. But that's why we have principals. Woo!
That's why they get the big bucks. There's no doubt about that. I think that, you know, you brought up some really good points, and they're things that you're going to have to struggle with. And if you think back about our survey that we did to the community, the one thing that was really polarizing on both sides were multiple comments about we want to maintain school choice, and multiple comments about we shouldn't have school choice because that's changing things the wrong way. And so there's a line here. And I think there's a really good way to get around it. It sounds like you have a structure that can certainly help you do that, because as long as you have a gatekeeper to school choice and you know, the gate is manned in the right manner, it'll be okay.
The other thing that we're not taking into account is that there's going to be a lot of movement of staff. And so we don't know. They may say that right now because every staff they know is at Mark Twain, but that could look totally different next year, you know? And so I'm a little worried that if we put too many options for them in place without them seeing what schools actually look like, that they're going to make those decisions before they really have the full picture too. Because our staff's going to move a lot, which is going to change the schools.
Yeah, very true. And I don't know if you allow teacher choice or requests or anything like that in your district, but there's another thing that will cause people to want to jump from building to building based on the people they know, the people they want their kids to be involved in their classrooms and so forth. And you'll have to have a plan for that, and you'll have to have a gatekeeper to make sure that that doesn't hurt you as an overall system. You really have to look at your kids as a whole and make sure that that's protected. Other things that you think we ought to weigh in as a work group to deliver the message to say this is something that we want you to plan or think about? Okay. So I know it's kind of hard to, you know, take in all the information, especially what Steve shared with all the little dots in the map and all that kind of stuff. But as you have the opportunity to think about that more, or to go back and review that, if you go back and look at the recording of this and see the maps, or go on and see his PowerPoint, any suggestions you have about, hey, could you try moving this to here, this line? Could you try drawing a line through this way? Stuff like that. Any ideas? It's really hard when you start drawing lines and dividing to, once you have it down, seeing things any other way. And, you know, I can't do it because I don't live there. I don't know your streets. I don't know those things. And so we have two scenarios, both of which are possibilities. They're not completely out of whack like the first two, you know, the 213 and 214. Those just don't work number wise. It just isn't possible. And so we do have two scenarios, scenario A and B, Pac-Man being the second one. And if there's tweaks to those, if there's different ways to look at it, if there's groups that you think we ought to try moving, let us know. Email me, email Steve, Scott, anybody. And Steve's more than happy to try different scenarios and keep looking at the numbers. I'm really curious to see what last year's student population dropped into the same scenario looks like. I think it's going to be the same, but I don't know. And so we'll find out.
Is there a way to like look at future projections of enrollment, because looking at those maps, it seemed like most of like the new development growths that Jason was showing earlier were in the Robert Frost boundary. I just remember that from the scenario B, like those green areas that Jason was saying, those were in the Robert Frost boundary and not in the Mark Twain boundary. So I'm just thinking about future growth for the school.
So I don't think there's any way in 5 maps to do that, because the only, and I'm speaking, Steve can tell better than I can, my belief is all of that information of where students live and who they are came to us when kids registered in schools. And therefore that's the information we have. And just like we don't know how many kindergartners are going to show up each year, we don't really know unless maybe they have siblings or something. And so, Steve, I don't believe there's any way to capture the others like that, future others. Is there?
I don't believe within the tool itself there is. I mean, there could be some manual, overlay or something of our own, projection based on a, scenario that we build out of there and try to add projections to it on our own. We could, maybe do that. I don't think there's a way within the tool itself to do that, but.
Okay. Dave.
A question for Steve, was there any base maps a part of that system that provided anything like household? Of course, yes, we can't produce what households will have kids, but was there any base maps that provided any type of household age or census data base maps that were available?
We just loaded our student information data out of our system. We created a file and did a secure download that they loaded into the system for us. So we do have a lot of this, the data related to those particular students, and then obviously where they live. But there's nothing within the map that if they're not registered within our school district, we wouldn't have data for other households if they're not linked to our school district. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that answers it. I was seeing if the company which we got it from had base maps or any census data regarding addresses and things that could be layered on top of our data.
I know they do have some other features. I mean, I'll have to double check to see what they have. I know they have internet capacity, bandwidth, those types of things. They have some data kind of coded in there wherever they could get data. So I'll double check on that, Dave. We were just, I guess, so intently focused on getting our data in and being able to map our students that I know we haven't even scratched the surface with the product. So there may be some other things we could possibly dig into. So yeah, I'll check on that.
That was a kind of a overarching question I had for just the process in general. It would be nice for somebody that has gone through a boundary change before, be able to share things like, hey, I wish we would have factored in more average class size at a higher capacity than we did, or feedback that says, I wish we looked at the boundaries this way instead of doing it this way. So any type of feedback you could get from them in those regards would be, from my perspective, helpful of if somebody's done it and has a best practice or can share some examples, that would be helpful.
Steve, I know like Canby School Districts has gone through a lot of boundary changes in the past. So that's something to look at.
Okay.
So other thoughts, questions before we wrap things up here? As we look ahead to the next meeting, we're going to continue to dive in a little bit deeper on what our options are with the 5 maps and any scenarios and changes that you're interested in. And also we will then start delving into some of the other questions that you need to, as a group, will choose to weigh in or not. For example, you know, what's a transition look like, phase in plan, things like that. And starting to solidify this plan. I'd encourage you to start talking to people that are especially kind of on the lines of those boundaries, and have them look at the information that'll be posted on the website and make sure that they're seeing, and you know, if they have concerns with it, that we hear about those. If they like where we're going, that they let you know that as well, because it's the input and the feedback that's going to drive what you ultimately do or make as a committee, decision wise. So, Rob, anything else?
I don't think so. It's so hard for me not to ask the question, do you seem to prefer A or B? Or, you know, do you have any ideas about how A or B? I'd love to hear if you have any ideas about how A or B might be modified a little bit in order to come up with a C, or if you have an idea about a C at all. And so I would hope that if you're thinking about those things, if you come up with something after talking to people or looking at it or whatever, that you would, you know, send a message our way, so that if you've got an idea, we can take a look at it in the meantime. But I think it's good for you to have to cogitate on it for a little while until our next meeting. And then we're going to have to get down to it and start asking the question about, you know, so what do you like? What would you recommend? So it's starting to get down to the time of making some of those decisions.
And we have 2 meetings left. The first one is 2 weeks from today, the first one of those 2. And we'll move on and hopefully be able to narrow this down from where we are right now. I want to again thank you for your time. Dave, you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, when would we be seeing maybe some of the, because I think from my perspective, needing to see last year's data into the system would be critical before forming some of those opinions. So I guess when would we be seeing, would we be seeing that information before the next meeting?
So let's see if we can put something together before the next meeting, and actually, even if it's a PowerPoint that we sent out to you, that you can see some of the screenshots and so forth, so that you had time to kind of digest that before we actually sit down and start pointing fingers about how this is going to work.
That would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other comments or thoughts?
I see something from Courtney here. Was there a specific Oh, it went away.
Okay, I really appreciate again the time that you spent. I know it's a long evening, but we're that much closer. I feel like we've made some movements. We'll sit down, look at criteria, we'll look at some options, and we'll get information out to you and be back together here 2 weeks from tonight. Okay, thanks so much for your input. Steve, thanks for your help on this.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.